Hello. In this video, I want to go over James Rachel's The Challenge of Cultural Relativism. So there are many attitudes that we have, moral attitudes that we have. So what I mean by that is there are many things that we believe with moral content. So for example, we believe that lying is morally wrong, or telling the truth is morally right, murder is morally wrong, and so on and so forth. So the question that we want to ask is, in virtue of what are these moral attitudes uh, true or false? What is it that makes our belief that murder is wrong true, for example? Well, there are two approaches or I guess, frameworks that we could think of, right? So one way of thinking about this is that the truth of our moral attitudes is solely based on or is determined based on what people or society agree upon. So if you live in a society that says that murder is morally wrong, and that's what makes your belief that murder is morally wrong true. On the other hand, we can also say, well, no, the belief that murder is morally wrong has nothing to do with what people or society deem to be the case, but it's something independent of people or society. So whether or not our belief that murder is morally wrong is true or false uh, is determined by factors that exist independently of people or society. We can characterize this distinction by the two following theses. So, on the one hand, we have what's called moral relativism. So, moral relativism is the idea that moral standards are determined by people or society. So, what makes a moral statement or a belief true or false is going to be whether or not society or people deem it to be morally right or wrong. So, take the proposition killing cows for food is morally permissible. A moral relativist would explain that this statement or belief isn't true or false simpliciter, but it's going to be true relative to a particular kind of set of cultural norms or society. So, for example, in America, this statement may be morally true, but in certain parts of India, for instance, it may be false. On the other hand, we have moral objectivism, and this is the idea that moral standards are not determined by people or society, but instead, moral standards, I suppose I should say, exist or are true independent of what people or society have to say. So, the statement or the belief killing cows for food is morally permissible is going to be true or false for everyone, not because of what peoples in these various different societies deem to be true or false, but for some other reason. Now, we won't go into what those other reasons are, but what makes it moral objectivism, or what makes it objective, the objective factor is that it is whether a statement or a belief, a moral statement or a moral belief is true or false, is going to be determined by factors independent of people or society. So again, one way again to think about the distinction between moral relativism and moral objectivism is that moral relativists see moral standards as being contained or being part of cultural norms. They're just another subset of what a culture or society or people deem to be an appropriate, way of behaving within society. Whereas moral objectivists would maintain that cultural norms like how to greet somebody, which side of the road to drive on, are in fact determined by people's or society, but moral standards are not. There's something separate that determines or moral standards. So Rachel's wants to argue against moral relativism. And the way that he goes about doing that is by showing that there's something wrong with the main argument in favor of moral relativism. This argument is known as the cultural difference argument. He ultimately wants to demonstrate that there's something wrong with premise three, that if we believe or we maintain that premise three is true, which is needed in order to get the conclusion that the moral relativist wants, then that's going to lead to some kind of absurd consequence. So we'll see what that absurd consequence is. But really briefly, the cultural difference argument goes as follows, right? So premise one, Different cultures have different cultural norms. That seems to be true. There's nothing contentious about that. And cultural norms are determined by people in society. Again, that also seems to be true. There's nothing wrong with that. Morality, the relativist says, is just a set of rules determined by people or by people or society. So in other words, morality is an extension of cultural norms. And premise 4, rules determined by people or society, are an extension of cultural norms. And so premise 5, if this is true, then there are no such things as objective moral standards, right? Because they're always going to be determined by different peoples in society. And if there are no objective moral standards, then moral claims are going to be true or false only relative to a society. So the statement, killing cows is morally permissible, is going to be true relative to one society or one group of people, but it could be false relative to another society or a different group of people. So the conclusion is that moral claims are true or false relative to peoples or society, which is essentially the main claim that the moral relativist wants to maintain. So what's the problem with moral relativism, or what's the problem with the argument presented in favor of moral relativism? Well, as James Rachel sees it, the main problem is with premise 3, the premise that states that morality is just a set of rules that are determined by people or a society. Well, why? Well, because if it is true that moral standards are just determined by people or society, then it's going to be the case that insofar as people or society agree on particular moral standards, then necessarily, or it follows that, or it means that those moral standards are going to be legitimate or true. And so we can see the problem when we start thinking of cases or moral cases where the kind of moral consequence is just very atrocious, or in other words, cases in which we know that these particular acts or conventions are just morally atrocious. So take the case of slavery. According to moral relativism, and in particular, right, what follows from premise 3 is that insofar as you have a people or a society at large that agree that something like slavery is morally permissible or morally right, then it follows that slavery is morally permissible or morally right. But the problem is that, of course, that can't be the case, right? No one thinks that, I should say, generally speaking, people don't think that slavery is morally right, is a morally right thing, or a morally correct practice. But it's something that would logically follow from premise 3, right? And it's supported, or I should say, it follows from moral relativism, and it's supported by premise 3, that insofar as people think that slavery is morally permissible, then it has to be the case that it's morally permissible. So what Rachel is arguing is that if we maintain the truth of premise 3 in the argument that we just saw, then it leads to these kind of absurd consequences. It leads to the permissibility of atrocious acts or practices like slavery or genocide in a society, insofar as the people within that society think that it is morally right. So this should kind of push back against the intuitions that we may hold that, morality is just another set of rules or norms that are just an extension of cultural norms from a society. That's what Rachel's insight is supposed to push back against. And if it pushes back against that, then it can't be that morality is just merely determined by what people in a society at large agree upon. It has to be determined by something else. Now, what's that something else? That's for another discussion or another debate. All that Rachel's wants to show is that whatever determines moral standards, it just can't be what people believe to be morally right or morally wrong. It has to be something else. It can't just be left to people's decision, because there are some people that think that something like slavery or genocide and so on, right? There could be a society that thinks that these practices are morally permissible. But again, that can't be the main justification for these moral practices. And that's the main problem that Rachel sees with moral relativism, and in particular with the argument in favor for relativism. To quickly recap, Moral relativism is the theory that moral standards, what makes actions morally right or wrong, or what makes um, propositions with the moral content like murder is morally wrong, true or false, is going to depend, or it's going to be true or false relative to a people or society, whereas moral objectivism maintains that whether a statement like murder is morally wrong is true is going to be independent of peoples or society. And the main argument in favor of moral relativism is the cultural difference argument. And James Rachel's argues against moral relativism by criticizing this key premise here, premise three. He maintains that if premise three is true, yes, not only does the conclusion follow, but what it allows for, or it opens up the door for, are these absurd consequences that, insofar as peoples or society think that some kind of atrocious practice or act is morally wrong, right, then that atrocious moral practice or act has to be deemed legitimate because it was determined by the people or society. So, say like an act of slavery or the practice of slavery. So, yeah, that is it.